Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments over the 900-page document Congress passed in 2010, known to many of us as Obamacare. The focus is on 4 words in the law, quote, established by the state. The court has to decide whether that means tax subsidies for insurance premiums should only go to people who are enrolled in state exchanges.
Our guest is former governor of Utah, former Health and Human Services Secretary, now chairman and founder of Leavitt Partners. It's a pleasure to welcome Michael Leavitt into MidPoint. Governor, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We are going to talk about Obamacare extensively, but before we do, I'd like to start off, if you don't mind, with what's happening in Washington at the current time. The discussion about Hillary Clinton, the emails, transparency and such, and as someone who has been in government a very long time, my question to you, what does this all tell us about the Hillary Clinton approach to leadership and honesty?
Well, first, I was surprised that the State Department allowed her to use her private email address. That, as a person who served in 2 cabinet roles, that surprised me. And I think it will undoubtedly bear a lot of scrutiny. And I think it'll open up a lot of questions in terms of how much access has to be granted to other parts of her email and not just those parts which she says were relevant.
Governor, what does it also tell us a little bit about the arrogance in Washington, D.C.? Because there are people right now, the American voters, they're looking at this, they're saying, wait a minute, we see this kind of lack of transparency so often from the people we send to Washington. Why should we think this is anything different?
There is a skepticism about government, and properly so. And I think this kind of incident undoubtedly plays into that.
How do we then repair that? How do the politicians repair that? It's easy to say honesty, but we've said that many times.
Well, transparency is often the forerunner of honesty. And I think in this case, transparency is required. She's obviously trying to get in front of this now by being as open as necessary, but I think there will be a lot of people who are going to say you've been less than transparent in the past. We'd like to see full transparency, and that'll add new pressure to this problem.
Does it sometimes catch you and bother you when we see so much that happens in Washington? We see so many different people that are sent there, leaders of states as well, and many times the electorate themselves, the citizens, they don't seem to care. Things happen. They are constantly hounded. The politicians lie, cheat, steal. Things happen. Yet they continue to put these same kind of people in office over and over and over again when they say they want change. That has to dismay you.
It does dismay me as an American, as I suppose it does you and many others. There's a desensitization that occurs. When these things happen so often, it just is, oh, well, there they go again. And we move on with our ordinary lives, hoping that the government will just stay out of our way and being irritated when they don't. But there is a requirement for a citizen, in a democracy, for involved citizens. And we all ought to bear that weight. We all ought to be recognizing that we owe a responsibility and that part of this problem is our own ambivalence and that we can't just blame them. We've got to also look within ourselves and say, what are we doing to hold them accountable?
In your opinion, would it then be the best thing that if this email gate, if you will, whatever you want to call it, continues to go further, we find out more and the former Secretary of State is injured even more by this? There's subpoenas that have now been issued. If all this happens as we believe it might, should she then do the right thing for America, step down and say, I will not run for president because I do not want to put the country through this?
I doubt that's going to happen anytime soon. The question is what she should do is obviously dependent on what actually is found. But my guess is we'll see this roll out over the course of some months. The Republicans will seize on it. It'll be a burr in her saddle. And frankly, I think it may mean that additional Democrats begin to look at the race and say, maybe Hillary isn't as invincible as she once seemed.
About 30 seconds left, then we'll take a break, come back, and we will focus in on Obamacare. But what does this then tell the Republicans at this point? People say they're going to hammer away on this. They'll use this in ads. Some people say that that might backfire, that maybe for the Republicans the best thing to do at the moment is stand back and wait before you attack. What do you think?
Anytime you are the presumed nominee of a party this early, you're going to be subject to this kind of attack. And frankly, if it's not this, it'll be someone else, something else. That's the problem with being a front runner this early. It's the reason that she would like to put off any announcement or any decision until later. This just comes with the territory.
That's a great way to put it, and we should say that a little more often when it comes to politics. If you get in the game, you got to learn how to play it. All right, Governor, please stand by for a couple of minutes. We're going to take a break, and we're going to make a turn to what's happening in the Supreme Court at this moment. The arguments, the debate, the massive disruption of America's health care that's looming over Obamacare, and what happens to opponents if the Health Care Act does stay in place. We're back with the Governor right after this on MidPoint. Let's get back to work with former Utah Governor and former Health and Human Services Secretary Michael Leavitt. Governor, let's turn to Obamacare then. The King v. Burwell case that is now being heard by the Supreme Court. Is this the best attack on Obamacare from the opponents, or is this a last-ditch attempt?
Well, it's potentially a very damaging problem for the administration. The court will decide that. Should the court choose to side with King, who is the plaintiff in this case, it could have a substantially disruptive impact on the ability to deliver subsidies which underpin the ability for them to expand health insurance. Should they side with Burwell, then it would likely be business as usual, except for the politics that will continue to play out.
Well, that's just it, the continuing politics then. So is this the best? I mean, and I've heard this before in the last couple of days, is this the best the Republicans can do in order to try and replace, repeal, get rid of Obamacare, or is this just their last shot before they realize that it's all over?
Well, those who continue to drive on the idea that we need to repeal and replace see this as a very disruptive wedge into the capacity to repeal it and replace it. And in fact, if the court rules with King, it will have that effect. It will force the administration into a place where they need to talk. Now, I believe the administration, were that to occur, will simply say to the Republicans, with one line of legislation, with a handful of words, you can fix this and save 7 million people, or whatever the number is, from losing their health insurance. The Republicans, on the other hand, will say, yes, but we don't like what it has produced and we want change. And we'll have a quite significant collision that will occur. But it won't be resolved overnight. The real deadline, the real pinch point happens in November of 2015 when the new plans for 2016 have to be put forward. So my guess is this is a drama that will play out beginning the end of June when the court rules, and it will play out intensely until we get to November. And it'll have the kind of dynamic political atmosphere that the so-called government shutdown had, because that you'll have two parties with strong views, both with a point of leverage.
Do you agree with the strategy taken by the White House? This came out in the New York Times today, that they do not have a replacement for Obamacare. They don't plan on it. They're not thinking about it. It would seem to be a great strategy sending a message to the Supreme Court.
I think that's what it is. I think it's a message to the Supreme Court. I don't believe for a minute that they haven't done a lot of scenario planning, and if they haven't, they're poor managers. Because whatever the chances are, it's not zero that this will be overturned. And if they've done nothing to think about what could occur, I understand them not talking about it. I think would make sense, because they're not about to hand the Supreme Court any reason to move against them. But if they're not thinking about it, they're not doing their job.
From your perspective then, as a former governor of Utah, what will this do then to the states who are going to need independent legislation if indeed Obamacare gets knocked down? This would seem to be a disaster for those states.
Well, the states, and the governors in particular, face a very serious problem, because they do have millions of people who are receiving some kind of subsidy from the federal government. And if the court creates an environment where those are no longer available, then you do have many people who will be faced with losing their health insurance. And once someone has a benefit like that, it's a very hard thing when they face not having it. Now, I believe for that reason the Republicans ultimately have to come up with a unified strategy that doesn't simply say, well, there's some people who aren't going to have insurance. They have to come up with a unified strategy that allows people to transition whatever occurs without losing in a one-time kind of cold turkey way. So there are those who are now beginning to look at legislation that would over time diminish it or replace it. But no one knows at this point how this is going to play out, because we don't know what the court's going to do, and we don't know how they will do it. They could remand it back to the district court. And if that happens, we could have another set of hearings at the district court as to what the remedy would be.
Got about 30 seconds left. Some Republican lawmakers say they do have a plan to replace, if indeed they win in this case in the Supreme Court. Do you believe them? After all this time and not hearing anything, do you think they really have something ready that could take over and really get people their health care?
I think there's a lot of plans. The question is, can they implement a plan? Can something actually be put into statute? This is a complicated matter, and it's going to require the collision of titans to ultimately create the kind of compromise that I suspect will ultimately have to occur to solve this.
Who do you like in that heavyweight battle, left or right?
Well, it depends on what the court says.
It will indeed. We continue to watch, and as you pointed out as well, it's going to take several months. We're not going to know right away, so everybody's going to be on those pins and needles for a long time in Washington. And everybody will have plans every single day that goes by. Governor Michael Leavitt, a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. As the leader of the Catholic Church grows in stature and popularity, there's a charge making rounds that the Catholic Church is broken and perhaps even beyond repair. There are some people who would disagree with that. Of course, you understand that we're going to have one of them join us next, right here, where we question everything on MidPoint.